good Wednesday to you this afternoon, this evening, getting ready for Wednesday night's Zoom prayer meeting tonight and doing some meditation on the Word of God. And I wanted to take an opportunity to spend a few minutes with you this afternoon, this evening, depending on when you watch this, just giving you some insight into the thinking, or at least my thinking, about what's going on as shepherd of our church and of our flock. And it'd be good for you to maybe have a little insight into that, to know what's going on in relation to our church and the virus and our inability to be able to meet together. And so I wanted to spend a few minutes doing that tonight and to give you a little window into my thinking and a lot of other pastors' thinking, because right now there is a great deal of confusion and consternation and hand-wringing and trying to figure out exactly what God has in store here, what's going to happen as far as our church meeting together again. Are we at the whims of our government and of those forces that are out there that almost seem nefarious in the way they're trying to keep us from meeting together? And yet you balance the other issues that are going on today, and a lot of pastors are really debating and going back and forth with what should be done, how should we view this, and there are just so many things going on right now that I'm working through myself, trying to prayerfully consider what God would have us to do. Many pastors, and I'm on some group chats with a lot of other pastors, and we're debating this out together. Some leading people in the Christian circles today are debating this back and forth, and the question continues to come up. The biggest one, I suppose, is should churches meet no matter what their government says? No matter what the government says, and that's the question. I am leaning on a lot of other men of God that have tried to work through this together and reason scripturally about how we ought to meet. Most of you probably know or understand that there are several reasons why we are not meeting. Number one, we want to be a good neighbor and testimony to those in our community. That's actually a big reason why we're not meeting right now at Heritage. I think a second reason, of course, would be, and this is not in any order of importance, but we want to do our best to protect the health of those that are in our church family and our congregation. We don't want to be the cause of anybody having some debilitating sickness or to see them fall away into terrible disease. And so we make that kind of decision. And then third, I think down the list, yes, is that our nation, our government, or those that are in authority have requested that we not do so in order to try to help the condition that's going on today, even in New Hampshire. Should a church listen to the government right now and stay closed? That's worthy of the thought that we want to give to it in the few minutes that I have today. And I want to reach those that are in our community. I don't think there's any question about that. We don't want to alienate them because they perceive us as being some kind of rebel or just doing so just at the expense of everybody else in our community and not caring about them. And there are times that we would tell our government and even our culture that know that we need to be serving God, that we are commanded to do so. But I don't know that now is the time for that right now. We have more people accessing our church website and Facebook page than ever before. People are reading and looking for answers, and they're hearing sermons on an unprecedented level at this point. And maybe, just maybe, perhaps God is using this time to spread His word in ways that we never imagined before. I don't have all the answers, and I don't pretend to, but I do think we need to think very carefully about should we meet in spite of what the government is recommending. And I want to make something very clear today, because this is a question, this is the biggest question right now on churches and church leaders' hearts. If the government told us not to meet because Christianity had been outlawed, because it had been singled out and our religious convictions were no longer tolerable, then the fact is we would have no option but to meet anyway. And we take our cue from the book of Acts, in particular chapter 5, where the leaders of Israel at that time told the apostle Peter that you are to stop preaching. Don't preach anymore in the name of Christ. It's illegal. You cannot do that. And of course, Peter's response was not something that was confusing or difficult. It was very simple. As a matter of fact, he went out, he said, you judge whether it's right for us to obey God, or rather, should we obey men? And then he went right back out. Guess what he did? He went right back out and preached anyway. If the government tells us to stop worshiping, if they make it illegal, if they tell us to stop preaching, if they tell us to stop going to church and stop communicating the gospel, we won't stop. We will obey God rather than obey men. If that puts us in jail, then all of a sudden our public ministry turns into a jail ministry, just as it did with the apostle Peter and Silas. The apostle Paul said in one of his letters that my going to jail has actually fallen out to the furtherance of the gospel rather than hindering it. So I don't want to go on record, and others have said this recently, I don't want to go on record as being a rebel and protesting and getting up in the face of those that are, I think, genuinely trying to safeguard the health of our community. You don't ever see Christians doing that in the book of Acts. In fact, they were persecuted, but they were still faithful to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ as God gave them opportunity. And if they were faithful to proclaim that, even if it took them to jail, God blessed their efforts. And that's always been the pattern of true Christianity, even from the very beginning in the book of Acts and through the centuries. That time is not now. Now, that may come in the future. I don't know how long the government's going to have these restrictions. But the reality is, and there are, and let's be honest, there are politicians with overtones of attacking Christianity. The government, this government, though, by and large, I think, though, the government is actually saying, listen, please do this for the protection of our society. And I don't want to be one who is going to create a bad testimony and convey to people that we're trying to reach for Christ, that we don't care about their health. And so that's why we're doing what we're doing. It's for the greater societal good, and that is the objective that we're trying to strive for, as I believe the government is. I don't believe right now that there is a concerted effort to try to outlaw Christianity. I think it's saying we want to conduct ourselves in this way because if we don't, people will become ill and die. Now, we may not think that we're going to have that impact on somebody, but you may think that you're not the one who is going to be the one that becomes a carrier and causes something to be passed on, and where untold people are ill and perhaps even die. And you may not think it's going to be you, but we have to be careful and not intentionally try to defy those that are in authority that God has commanded us to obey, as long as it does not impinge and impact on our profession of faith and our labor for the Lord. I don't want to go there. So, what does the gospel cause say? We don't want to be the cause of anyone's sadness, of their sorrow, of their sickness, and certainly anyone's death. So we're going to comply with what's going on. It does not set well. I don't like it. I'd rather us be together to be able to conduct the work of worship and business, but we don't rebel. I don't do protests. I don't fight the government. I don't harass and harangue. I don't call them names. I don't march. I don't get in parades. We don't stop traffic. We lead, as the apostle said, quiet and peaceable lives, praying for those that are in authority over us, and we submit ourselves to them. In Romans chapter 13, Paul specifically says, submit yourself to the government of the powers that be. Peter adds to that, you submit yourself to the governor as king. And whoever that personal authority is that's in our particular office, then I want to make sure that we are in compliance to that. Now, I've heard people say, well, that's not constitutional. It's really irrelevant at this point. When you're told by an authority to do something and it's for the greater good of society, physically, that's what I do because I want to be able to be a testimony for the Lord? How do we back out of that and communicate the love of Christ? Jesus came and basically banished disease from Israel. He was a healer. The last thing that the Church of Jesus Christ wants to do is to be a group of people that in defiance make somebody sick. So we restrain ourselves from that. Richard Baxter, man of God back in the 1600s, actually wrote in his book, John MacArthur talks about this even in his interviews, he records that Richard Baxter said, if the magistrate, as he calls them back then in the 1600s, asks you to refrain from meeting because of a pestilence, you do not meet. On the other hand, if the magistrate tries to force you not to meet because of the persecution of Christianity, you meet anyway. That's the dividing line. Folks, for the time being, we're going to meet within the guidelines of what our government would have, and we want to be a good testimony to those. Pray for your church. Pray for your pastor. Pray for one another. Let's ask the Lord to minister grace to our ministry and that we would grow in Him. Pray for the success of our church and these sermons and devotionals that go out. Support your church. Listen, this is not the time to rob God. Malachi said, Prophet Malachi, continue to give and support the ministry God's called us to. Our giving has dropped, but we know God's going to take care of us. Be faithful. Support through prayer and finances, and the Lord's going to see us through all this together as we labor for Him. God bless you. I love you all. I pray for you all the time, every day. Walk with Christ.